Hi, everyone, and welcome to this piece of the Good Doctor's coverage of anything. I am Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
And we are two social scientists who have PhDs in essentially how the world works, to put it kind of broadly. But we are also obsessed with analyzing culture, both popped and lived, to understand empathy better and to also help you do the same.
This video is part of our Good Doctors Diagnose series, where we take a look around at what's trending, what's happening in the news, and we offer our expertise and our advice on it. Hence, we diagnose whatever the issue tends to be. Today is Monday, March 30th. The end of March, not the Ides of March, the ends of March. And today we're talking about critiquing corporate talking points that comes very specifically from a webinar on racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that we sat in on last week that had some people from some corporate positions at some big companies. And we found that we were having a much better conversation in our Slack channel than they were having in front of us. So we thought it would be an apt topic for this series today.
There are lots of corporations who are doing some great things around diversity and inclusion. And they would be happy to tell you about it, especially if they're publicly traded. My skepticism for how actually lived that is across all intersections of diversity, I will admit to being very, very skeptical of that. First of all, because a lot of the conversations that you hear, and this was certainly the case on the webinar, entirely had to do with racial diversity. Mm-hmm. It did not make any acknowledgement of other intersections of diversity, gender, sexuality, ableism, neurodiversity, any of that. It didn't address a single thing. The way they talk about talent in corporations, there is a certain personal threshold you have to meet before they care if you're diverse or not. And I don't think we're talking about, I've never gotten the impression in a lot of these corporate talking points that we're talking about a diverse, inclusive culture that goes to the janitorial staff, or that also includes the temp workers, or that also makes sure that, people delivering the mail are going to be treated with respect. Because if you really have a diverse, inclusive, respectful culture, whoever walks through the door and whoever works there and whoever is attached to it is treated the same. But corporations, from what we can observe, cannot do that by the very nature of A, how big they are, B, how much money they have to report, and C, if they're traded publicly.
And I think one of the things that really came from this webinar that we both agreed on was when you get big corporations in there with like really high numbers of employees, you are distinctly positing solutions from a top-down perspective.
100%.
Which means you're like literally at the top of that pyramid, looking down at the rest of the pyramid of all the folks that engage with your organization and passing down solutions that way. And we always advocate for a more grassroots or a more bottom up kind of approach, or certainly one that brings those people along. And, they might have done a lot of kind of navel gazing and asking for perspectives and feedbacks from their folks at these institutions and these companies that were on this webinar, but we didn't hear about that.
And all we heard about were statistics.
Yeah. And so we heard from the perspective of the corporate diversity officer or the person in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusivity, and how they built those structures. And from our perspective as people who study how structures work within cultures, things are a lot more stable and widespread when you bring people in on the decision-making process, when you ask for feedback, when you organize from the bottom up as well as from the top down and find places to meet along the way. And so it was off-putting, to say the least, for both of us. We have a lot of questions. We may be hosting our own small business roundtable on DEI initiatives in the future, but we definitely thought it was some food for thought.
Additionally, a lot of corporations are only going to be able to give you large-scale statistics and then individual story talking points. They're not going to be able to give you large-scale qualitative data because A, they're not interested in it, to be completely frank, because it's more expensive, it's more time-consuming, and it will potentially poke holes in their narrative. I just need to be honest. They are not beholden to their employees if you are a publicly traded company. You are beholden to your shareholders. That is the point of a publicly traded company. And so the three companies that were there today, I know two of them at least were Fortune 100 and are publicly traded. And so in their stock reports, there have to be DEI sections. And people who pay for the stocks just want to know if you tick a box. They don't want to know if you've really cultivated this kind of thing. And from our perspective, like, that's charming. Like, that's great. I'm so thrilled that you have 85% of whatever have gone through this training. And that's great. Those are all helpful things. But the attitude among how the media, and I hate saying that, but like how our national conversation happens around DEI at corporations is that those statistics tell the whole story. And that as long as you have X number of this population in these particular, we have reached it all. When the issue is a couple quick things. One is that no one represents their entire population. So even if you have, like, you are very, very careful to intentionally hire people all along the color spectrum to address colorism within the African-American community, those people cannot speak for this is how light-skinned people, this is how darker skinned, like, they can't do that. And statistics assume that they can. And in terms of diversity and inclusion, it is also ongoing work. And when we report on statistics, we are much more easy to lull our brains into the idea that the work is finished. And that's really, really damaging. My cynicism about large corporations is a pretty, like, shared American trait these days. I think a lot of us are pretty skeptical of large corporations. But there's lots of reasons to be. And in large corporations, it is a lot easier to hide behind data and hide behind the budget lines that you can throw at this. And what we were concerned about is all the potentially people. There was 1,700 of us on the call, the host said a few times. How many people were more in like a smaller business position? They have exactly $0 to throw at a diversity and inclusion initiative, and they just wanted to know where to start. And Reebok cannot help you with that. Like, Comcast cannot help. Those were not the companies on the call. Cannot help you with that because they have 17 entire line items that they can do with it. That's just not what they can do. And that's completely fine. But I find often, welcome to this soapbox with Dr. Kristen, that when we talk about DEI initiatives at corporations, we pretend that it's ubiquitous. It can be applied at every level of every kind of company. And that's what Dr. Erin was particularly talking about with the top-down approach. It just can't, especially, you might be able to get away with not getting buy-in at DEI at Comcast. You might be able to do a top-down approach and get away with it, and the statistics are going to be fine. But if there's like 30 of you in the building and it's just the guy at the top that's saying this is how it's going to go, that culture is not going to work. And your DEI isn't going to be DEI. It's going to be whatever his pet project is. That's just how statistics work in terms of the research. I've ranted long enough. Dr. Erin, do you have anything else to say? I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was so passionate about this.
As you can tell, we have a few thoughts about this particular topic, but I hope you've gained some insight from our discussion. And we really wanted to almost just posit this to say it's important to critique these talking points. It's important to examine where these perspectives are coming from, how the data and information was collected, as Dr. Kristen was talking about in terms of quantitative and qualitative. And from our perspective as qualitative researchers who love and work with quantitative researchers, you need both. You always need the humans behind the numbers. And so, especially, as Dr. Kristen pointed out, if you're in a much smaller organization than Comcast, because you've got a lot more humans than numbers to work with. So we hope we've given you some things to think about when you're invited to these webinars, as we are, and trying to find out whether you can learn from these folks. And that is our Good Doctors Diagnose for this Monday. We hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.